Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Huang, a teacher at the Suzhou University Zhang Huqian Center for the Study of Human Rights. We are very fortunate this morning to have Professor Dulles Seymour with us. He had a Chinese name, Sima Jin. That I know Professor Dulles Seymour for many years, and through his long career, we have worked together on quite a few projects. He is indeed very close, if that is the word, with Taiwan. That he came to study Chinese language in Taiwan in the 1960s. That was quite early, while he was studying at Columbia University. And he wrote on first on the minority party in China, the 民主同盟.
民主同盟还有其他的 other half a dozen different parties. The 同盟 was the main one, yes.
Right. 民主同盟还有另外的小党.
Right.
And then later on, he turned to the study of that is human rights in Asia, in particular in China, in Taiwan, and he published a journal that is entitled The Spearhead, quite early, which again promote human rights in Asia. And later on, of course, he was a great help to me in the Taiwan Human Rights Journal that we published here, and with the Human Rights Dictionary, which was done in the 1990s. But he was not only kept to the ivory tower, he took part to a very large extent in many social activity, in social movement. He was the head of the Amnesty International New York University branch, and was on mission to Taiwan during the 1970s and early 1980s. At that time, I think he had a little bit more to say about the human rights situation, which was very difficult in Taiwan, and what his mission were about. And his testimony in the United States Congress certainly was very crucial for the development of democratic rule, for the agitation for democratic rule in Taiwan. Again, I would let him speak a little bit more so that our audience would have a greater degree of understanding. And then in the past few years, he divided his time between New York City, Columbia University, and Hong Kong, the Chinese University in Hong Kong, doing research and teaching on the Tibet and Xinjiang, that is referred to as the Great Western Area of China, 大西北. And during this time, he worked closely with Han Donghuang on promoting labor movement in China and defending the interest and well-being of the laboring class in China. So Well, as you can appreciate that he had done so many things, so I would ask him to say a little bit, to say more about his work and his experience, and we'll go from there. Professor Seymour.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Huang. As you say, we go back a long way to more than 6 decades, I think, when we were both students at Columbia University, and now here we are again. So I became interested in China, Chinese studies over the course of the 1950s, and then I expected to be drafted into the Army and be sent to Vietnam, and on a fluke, for a very strange reason, the Army rejected me. So I decided, well, they've just given me 2 years of my life back, or maybe my whole life back. What do I really want to do? So I wanted to come to East Asia and study Chinese. Well, in those days, Americans could not go to China, and Hong Kong was not a very good place to learn Guoyu. And Taiwan was not a perfect place to learn Guoyu, but not bad. A lot of mainlanders. Most of my friends here that I developed over the course of about 8 months were mainlanders. And Huang introduced me to a whole lot of different people. And I would go to class at Shifang Daxue Guoyu Zhongxin. And for the lunch break, I often went to Huang's parents for lunch. Huang was still in New York, but I visited his parents quite frequently. They lived in a lovely old Japanese-style house, which I'm sure has long since been torn down, but I really liked that house. So those were very repressive times in Taiwan. I was rather careful when I was here as a student. I kept my ears open and my mouth shut. That didn't last forever. I became more vocal. And after Chiang Kai-shek, Chiang Kai-shek passed away in 1975, the government announced that there would be a commutation in Jianxing of prisoner sentences. So the human rights organization Amnesty International asked me to come to Taiwan from New York and appeal to the government to include political prisoners in the commutation. So that was my first sort of mission to Taiwan, to promote human rights. And then Amnesty International sent me again a few months later hopefully to attend the trial of 8 political prisoners. The trial was held in Jingmei, and unfortunately when I got to Jingmei, the local authorities would not permit me to observe the trial. So you could say I came all this way from New York to Taipei for nothing, but it turned out to be rather productive because I met a whole lot of people, young dissidents who were not famous then, but they became famous later on. In fact, many of them went to jail in the wake of the Mei Lidao incident. So that's sort of my history as far as Taiwan is concerned.
Yes, I think many people in Taiwan know you quite well, and they thought, and they still think that at that point, certainly you were quite supportive and sympathetic to Dang Wai, to the.
Well, I always try to not be too partisan about it and not support this political group or that political group. I just support human rights and democracy, and what the people of Taiwan decide to do with their future is not really my business, but promoting human rights I consider to be my business.
I think, yes, I think you are quite right. I think that is the right position to take, and that position would allow you to go very long way. That is not to be so partisan, but it is kind of difficult. Certainly, when I survey the situation around me, certainly
it kept me off the government's blacklist throughout the 1970s until 1980. Unfortunately, in 1980, maybe I crossed a line. Maybe I was lost my non-political bona fides, and so I landed myself on the blacklist. But you could say I'm proud to say that I've been on both the Kuomintang's blacklist and the Communist Party's blacklist at one time or another. So at least I could claim to be even-handed.
Right. That definitely, for me, that definitely proved that you had done something right. But as I was saying, that it's kind of difficult, and many of my colleagues, very well educated professors in the university, that would at some point would be drawn into one camp or the other. So I think for me, the lesson I learned is that really this political turmoil really pose very serious problem for the intellectual. Yeah. And if you study the intellectual, the Chinese intellectual for the past 100 years, you would know very well that it's very difficult not to decide, and they all end up really in very difficult, very bad situation.
And I had friends here who settled on very different approaches to how to handle the situation. Some were quite militant, even lived in exile in Japan, and supported Taiwan for the Taiwanese, and other people much more cautious, sort of, you might say conservative liberals, people like Huang, professor at Taida later, but he and I, Huang and I, were originally introduced to each other by Huang, right? And then he and I came here on a freighter, a Huotran, and that's how I first got to Taiwan. And he was always very cautious, tried not to antagonize the Kuomintang, tried to stay in the good graces of the Kuomintang, at the same time promoting the cause of constitutional government. So I had friends who took all these various different approaches to how to deal with this situation. Obviously, there was no right way to do it or no wrong way to do it. Everybody had to figure it out for himself.
Quite so. Now the year that you divide your time between New York and Hong Kong, that what kind of research and teaching you have been doing, and what kind of activity you have, social activity that you have participate and you have support?
Well, I moved to Hong Kong, having retired from Columbia in 2005, and the reason for the move had to do with my personal life, family situation. But once I got to Hong Kong, I became somewhat active at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Zhongwen Daoshui, and well, they were setting up a new master's degree program in called Global Political Economy, and they wanted to offer a course in the English name of the course was the Development of West China and the New Silk Road. At that time, the Silk Road was sort of the buzzword. Everybody was interested in the Silk Road, and they couldn't find anybody to teach this course. So one of the people setting up this program said to me, would I teach the course? And I said, gee, development of West China and the new Silk Road, what's it about? And they said, well, whatever you want it to be about, it can be about. So I developed this course out of whole cloth, a lot of political, cultural, historic background, and then political economy, a lot of environmental, ecology issues, just the whole gamut, focusing on West China and to some extent Central Asia. So I had a lot of fun with this course. As the Chinese tightened their grip more and more on Hong Kong, it became more and more untenable to teach the history of what is now West China objectively, because these were all countries which were kind of negotiated out of existence between China and the neighboring country, which usually was Russia, and those countries ended up kind of being divided in half. But that's not the way the Chinese understand their history. Their understanding of history is that Xinjiang has been part of China for 2,000 years. Tibet has been part of China, they used to say since the Tang, which is no basis for that. So they say, well, since the Yuan, since the Mongol period, which is not wrong, but it's a kind of odd interpretation of history. So I teach all this stuff from my point of view, which is rather different from their point of view. And so you will be shocked to hear that the course is no longer offered, but I had a lot of fun while I was able to keep it alive.
So you have been teaching that course for quite some years.
A decade, yes.
A decade, yes. Now, I have been struck in the past few years that Beijing had emphasized more and more on historical claim that is in their position.
Right.
No matter it's about the South China Sea or it's Diaoyitai, and now it's Xinjiang and Tibet. Now, how you interpret this emphasis on historical claim?
Well, as far as the South China Sea is concerned, the big issue is China going to respect international law or not. There is a huge body of law of the sea, which China supposedly adheres to, but they kind of interpret it out of existence. I have a sort of peculiar American point of view on all of this because after the United States got its independence from Britain, England in the 1770s. We thought we had solved all of the problems with England, but all of a sudden the British were kind of nasty to us on the oceans. And we were a weak country and they were a strong country. And so we fought what Americans consider the War of 1812. Right. Nobody else calls it that, but we call it that. And one of the main issues was freedom of the seas. And from the American point of view, that issue of everybody, weak countries, small countries, have equal access to the seas and shouldn't interfere with anybody else. And nobody has a right to privatize or territorialize. I remember you used to joke about how the British considered the Mediterranean or as a private lake. Yeah. But that was contrary to what Americans consider basic principle of freedom of the seas. So now we're sort of trying to uphold this principle in the South China Sea, but it's not so much up to us as the countries bordering on the South China Sea, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and it's a question of can those countries pull themselves together and form some kind of unity and stand up for the principle of freedom of the sea, or are they each going to try to grab a little piece of it, in which case they'll never prevail because China is going to grab the whole thing. So you either decide this on the basis of international law. That's quite different from Tibet, which of course was a country and really not controlled by China. You could say it was part of the Qing dynasty, but the Manchus ruled this great international empire. Their own homeland was one country. They thought of the Dongbei as their country, and then the Han area was China, and Tibet was Tibet. And the Manchus, the Qing dynasty, ruled over this entire area. So that's quite a different situation from Xinjiang, which was very fragmented, and of course then there's Mongolia, which ended up being kind of divided in half becoming a Soviet satellite and half becoming Chinese. The Soviet part ended up as a free and independent and democratic country. Inner Mongolia, not so lucky. And then there was Korea. The Japanese and the Manchus agreed that the line through kind of Korean territory would be at the Tumen and Yalu rivers. So the northern part of that, Yanbian, ended up in China, and the southern part ended up a Japanese colony until 1945.
Now, you refer to 一带一路, One Belt, One Road. That when that idea was first proposed, I thought, even I knew that probably would not happen, but I thought that could it be that the commitment to One Belt, One Road would nudge China, nudge Beijing closer to adhering to international law. But up to this point, it doesn't turn out to be like that. But at one point, I think probably for a very brief period of time, I posed the question in some of my writing that could it be a turning point that China will indeed join the international community, and One Belt, One Road would promote this commitment to the international law.
Well, you're being very charitable toward the old imperialist powers. I don't think they ever, in reality, adhered to these principles that you're saying are so lofty, and China is behaving very much like the old imperial powers, just trying to gain economic influence, loaning money to all these little countries, including Pacific Island countries, and getting them deeply in debt. And it's quite a worrisome situation from the point of view they're really sacrificing their independence in the name of economic development, and it's economic development that China is controlling. So in many ways it's very good. Railroads across Asia, nobody can really argue with that if it facilitates international trade. But if it means China getting a grip and politicizing the development of these countries in a way that benefits China, then it's somewhat worrisome.
I don't think I illusion about the all imperial empire, as you can say, but I was hoping that China could, if that is the word, could be to some degree different from the all imperial empire. Well, here you had, okay, now here you had the traditional value of China, and which of course that we can interpret somehow differently. And then of course there is the commitment, or on paper, more to communism, to socialism. Now, I think you'll be delighted to know that one of our friends, Professor Zhou Yangshan, you remember him because we are a student of Professor Hu, in many of his pieces in the newspaper in the past year, argue, to my great surprise, argue that the One Belt, One Road really is in the tradition of Confucian's idea in how China handle its relation with the neighboring country is absolutely not selfish. That is a commitment to help the weaker and small country. So that our Professor Zhou Yangshan argue even to this day as a steward of traditional Chinese.
That's a very traditional Chinese way of looking at it, that the emperor reigns over, in the first place, China, but then gradually all of Tiansha, and Tiansha keeps expanding and expanding, and all the people in Tiansha, they're sort of focused on Zhongnanhai. I mean, I can understand that point of view, but it's not a point of view that all these powerless countries are really enamored with.
Well, another student, or to be more precise, disciple of Professor Hu, Professor Zhu Yinhan, he presented himself as a visionary, seeing the future so clearly. In his view, United States certainly have been declining. Well, that I don't think many people would dispute or quarrel with him. But more than that, he argued that China is taking the lead, that given this earth-shaking transformation of the world situation, the Chinese model, I assume the Chinese model of development will prevail, and China is going to lead the whole world into a absolutely new era. Of course, no. And you know, you and me and Professor Hu have been friends for almost half a century. But I must say, and I don't want to push this point, that in his later years, that he was moving closer to the position of Beijing. No, Hu. Moving closer to the position of Beijing, arguing in an interview he had with some journal, and that again was for me what was kind of difficult really, arguing that under the Communist rule that Chinese people perhaps had lose some of their individual freedom, but the Chinese state had gained a great deal in the larger freedom. So in the end, he returned to these theses of individual freedom, the small freedom, and the larger freedom of the state. And I cannot quite accept that, but of course I respect his position. So that's what I've been saying about the difficult situation that the rapid change in the political map had done to the intellectual.
Well, Chinese nationalism is a very powerful force, and it used to be somewhat limited, that we were just trying to undo the damage that was done to China by the imperialist powers, Japan, the Western countries, and so forth. But now, that sort of limited form of nationalism has been replaced by a much more expansive view of nationalism. And that's, and furthermore, the Chinese are so proud, justifiably proud, of being an economic powerhouse in the world. Of course, you know, countries have their ups and downs, economies have their ups and downs. It's not always going to be a bed of roses for China. But in recent years, China has seemed to be doing very well and rich and able to lend money to and therefore dominate many other countries. All the time saying, but we never interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries. That's the line. Well, in the end, they seem to end up doing quite a bit of interfering in the domestic affairs of other countries.
Oh, they have. I'm quite concerned. I'm quite worried about this almost this extreme or blind nationalism in China. That I cannot convince myself that this in the long term would be to the good of China and certainly for Asia as well. I think it can be quite dangerous. It can be quite dangerous. Of course, I'm hoping again that I'm hoping for the best, saying that somehow it would not bring about ruin for China and for everyone else around China.
Right.
Now, and I don't know how. Now, Taiwan is put in a very difficult situation, and not only that, Taiwan internally is very divided, as you know. You have been to Taiwan so many times, and certainly in your visit this time, that you come at a moment that politics is the concern, is the talk of the town. Everybody is very much preoccupied about the election to what is your thinking?
Well, I sort of try not to dabble too much in Taiwan politics, but just, as an American, I come from a country where the country is extremely divided. There's no center anymore. There are the people that support Trump and the people that oppose Trump. And I view Taiwan as a little, it seems to me there is a center here still. That in general, people support the status quo. They realize that if you go too far in the direction of independence for Taiwan, that will be provocative and might really cause big problems for Taiwan. And of course, the other extreme, the people that want to cozy up to China and make a deal and work out some agreements that Beijing is satisfied with. But those groups on the extremes are rather small, and I don't follow Taiwan politics all that closely, but it seems to me there seems to be some sort of consensus of we just have to muddle through. We can't declare independence, we don't want to be a province of China, so we'll just have to abide by this very imperfect situation, but it could be a lot worse.
I think that the more extreme forces, as you say, they are minority, but they are quite vocal. They speak very loudly, and so that do you think there is this danger that they, what you refer to as the middle position, cannot hold on indefinitely, that somehow more people will be driven either to this camp or that camp? Do you sense that, or?
Well, that's what happened in the United States. Everybody drifted either to the left or the right, and there's no center. I don't see that happening yet in Taiwan. Maybe it will, but it seems to me that everybody sees the risks, and so it does seem to be, there is a center here.
Okay.
And we'll see what in January, what
Right.
happens to the election.
To be explicit, you would be saying that if Tsai Ing-wen were or is re-elected, that the center still hold. Is that more or less your idea?
Well, that's certainly a likely scenario, yes. I don't know if I can predict that. I'll have a better sense of things in a couple of months, but I think that that's what, I don't say that I'm talking about any particular candidate for president, but in general.
No, I'm not saying that you are supporting either or any of the candidate for presidency. Right. At this time, probably still is kind of difficult to be certain that for the first time you had on the side of the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, a fairly charismatic leader coming from the people, so to speak, and that posed a new challenge certainly for the Democratic Progressive Party, and they have been criticized. Certainly, the government have been criticized on many fronts that they have not done that well either. So we just had to wait and see, in a sense.
And be thankful that you don't have the problem of populism here, you know, the powerful leader that comes up with a few simple solutions. Who was it who said for every difficult problem there's a simple solution and it's always wrong? That's what these populist leaders in the United States and Britain do. And it does not give rise to the execution of carefully thought out policies.
No. But what about the safeguard that you could have recourse to in the judicial branch? That is the rule of law. Certainly, both in United States and UK, you had a long tradition of the rule of law, and many people indeed hoping that if Trump can be checked, or Boris Johnson, that probably will have quite a bit to do with this long tradition of the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. What?
Well, I have more confidence in the rule of law in England and Taiwan, I would say, than I have in the United States. We've just seen that the courts have said that the Prime Minister in UK could not suspend Parliament. I mean, that was a very constructive move. In the United States, unfortunately, beginning with Nixon, you began to see the politicization of the Supreme Court. The Republicans appointing hard right conservatives, starting with Rehnquist and now with Gorsuch, people that could be counted on to support the Republicans and in their decisions, so they're no longer really legal decisions but political decisions. And of course the Democrats have tried to appoint liberals to offset that, but they've been rather unlucky, so the majority are now quite conservative. And two people on the Supreme Court are, I would say, and I think most reasonable people would say, that they committed perjury, that is, they lied during their confirmation hearings. And so there you have on the Supreme Court, 2 out of the 9 judges have committed crimes, and they are telling us which laws we have to follow and which laws we should not have to follow. And it's obviously a very political decision from the point of view of the justices. So it's a very upsetting situation in the United States, and I do hope we can come back to find some other way to appoint Supreme Court justices so we can return to the rule of law and not have a Supreme Court that's just a political body.
Well, I kind of agree with you more on the United States situation. But as far as Taiwan, certainly I think that we don't have that kind of tradition, that kind of rule of law. It is kind of is a new thing for Taiwan, and it will take time to build up.
Right.
It will take time to build up. So what the judiciary does or does not do in the next few years, and faced with some of the new cases which will definitely come, will be
Let's hope so.
will tell a great deal. Yes.
Yes, well, you have this kind of odd situation of the 5 branches of government in Taiwan, which was supposed to be an improvement over the 3 branches of government, and checks and balances. You know, when the United States was established, it just was at a moment in history where checks and balances and separation of powers was considered very important. We got this idea from the French. Very quickly realized that there are a lot of problems with that, and so no other country really picked up on that. I mean, you have an independent judiciary, that's all you need. You don't really have to have the legislature and the executive checking each other all the time. That's the road to stalemate. So thank God other countries did not follow the American example in that.
Well, I think we still have to deal with the legacy of the 5 branches, 5 power constitution. And at one time, certainly, the Democratic Progressive Party had been talking about abolishing the 考试院 and the 监察院, but they did not done that. And at this time, in the control yuan, that is the 监察院, is absolutely deadlocked because it's so openly divided into laws, commissioner appointed by the previous or through the long decades of the KMT rule, and those 11 recommended and appointed by Tsai Ing-wen. And so they are openly divided. It is really quite astonishing situation. So
well, you know, Sun Yat-sen came up with this idea of the 5 branches, and the founding fathers of the United States came up with this idea of the 3 branches. So it looks great on paper, but actually working out in practice, there are more problems than there are solutions.
Right. That, but then what comes next? I think we are all searching. We are all searching, and certainly you and I certainly will not bet on the new model that Beijing has been so proudly advocating for so long. I don't think that would do. I think you agree with me on that. Now you have done so many things. You have your study, your research on the great western area in China, that is Tibet and Xinjiang, have been superb. I think your lecture yesterday in the workshop was very well received. Now, what are you going to do next? All right. All these.
Well, you've been pestering me for many months now to write something for you about Xinjiang.
Yeah.
And so I promise you when I get back to Hong Kong, my first order of business, and I have a ton of materials to go through.
I know.
Don't expect it quickly, but I will do it.
Okay,
And so I'll write an article for your wonderful journal. Can I put in a plug?
Yes,
For
sure.
the Taiwan Renshin Shekan. Okay.
Right. In this volume, we have your great article about the dispute between the term people, 人民, and nation, 民族, in the first article of the ICCPR. That was a great article and still is. And I assume you'll be talking about that this afternoon in my class. So that would make that would be great.
But can I say for the record
Yes.
that I got onto this subject in the first place because someone called my attention to the fact that the version of the International Human Rights Covenants that the UN passed and the version that you find if you go to the UN website were very different. And you were the person that told me about that. And so I looked it up and I dug around and I found indeed the handwritten but signed by all the powers, equally authentic 5 languages, of which Chinese was one, and quite different from what you find if you go to the UN website and go through and read what the Chinese version or fake version of the International Human Rights Covenants. You put the bee in my bonnet to begin with.
Oh.
Any mistakes, I attribute to you.
All right, did I? All right. If it were me, I think it's a very exciting inquiry to get into that. So I'm very pleased that you took upon that. So that and then certainly we have been talking about to come up with a new human rights dictionary. We will talk about that later.
Okay.
Now, which achievement in your long career, both in academic and in the public service, you are most proud of, and which event or which activity that you think was the most serious setback for you, that you regret that it had happened?
The most serious what?
Setback.
Setback.
Or
Oh.
that worry you that you
Well, I've been involved with various human rights and civil society organizations. Right now, I'm chairman of the board of the U.S. section of an organization. We keep a very low profile, so you probably never heard of it. It's called the Rights Practice. And we try to help local organizations, civil society organizations in China on the mainland, human rights organizations, women's organizations, and labor organizations, and the lawyers that are defending people accused of crimes. We try to give both sort of intellectual and know-how support and financial support if we're able to raise money for the purpose in China. And the setback is that Xi Jinping is not very enthusiastic about the whole concept of civil society. And in fact, the 7 no-nos, the 7 things that you're not supposed to talk about in universities, number 2 is civil society. So it's in the last couple of years, it's become increasingly difficult for international civil society organizations such as the Rights Practice and China Labor Bulletin and Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, very difficult to function in China. The local partners that we help are becoming increasingly nervous about receiving international support. And some of our people that go to China, they get denied their visas, and the whole idea of getting financial support, we have to kind of keep that quiet because that's could get our local partners in trouble if they become perceived as just sort of running dogs with foreigners. So the big setback, and I hope it's only temporary, but that's it. It's just more and more difficult for international civil society organizations to function in China.
Now, you indeed, keeping a very low profile, I had not the right practice, and since when? Since when was this organization set up?
Well, there are a lot of little groups often associated with universities or associated, lawyers groups. The lawyers have a way of getting into trouble and getting themselves arrested. And just for trying to enable people who are in legal trouble to exert their legal rights. And sometimes the lawyers get arrested for doing their job. And there are various, like AIDS support groups and all sorts of groups that try to help the people who do not have hukou, and sometimes very difficult for a family to send their children to a local school because they don't have a local hukou. There are all these little issues that get neglected by the government, but there are organizations in China trying to make progress in these areas, and we work with those organizations. We let them take the lead, and we just give them help where they need it.
And you are still working with the China Labor Board?
Well, right now, this new organization takes all my time, so I'm not really working with China Labor Bulletin, but they're doing strong, they're doing wonderful work to help workers in China organize and engage in collective bargainings. So Han Dongfang's group, China Labor Bulletin, does a wonderful job in that area. We have a kind of division of labor. We don't do too much. We don't promote the rights practice does not promote collective bargaining and that sort of thing. We leave that to China Labor Bulletin.
Okay. Now, Han Dongfang, you still living and working in Hong Kong?
Right.
That should be a very difficult situation, would you say?
Well, so far I'm not aware. I mean, Hong Kong has a lot of troubles, but the Hong Kong-based organizations that help the Chinese, the problem is in China, it's not in Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong has a lot of problems, but as far as these international, that's the only one that I think of offhand that's based in Hong Kong. This one is based in London, the rights practice. It is...
The rights practice is based in London.
Right.
Okay. Very good, very good.
Because Amnesty International is based in London.
Right. So you are still doing a great deal of work. You are not retired in any genuine sense.
Maybe I'm spread a little thin.
Yes, yes. Now, what great achievement you have done? What you have
Well, one thing that I think my main academic book that made the greatest contribution, and nobody reads because nobody's particularly interested in this subject, but got interested in the China's prison system in the 1990s. Came about because I happened to meet somebody in Hong Kong, a Shanghaian, who had spent 10 years in a prison run by the Xinjiang Shengshan Zhenshe Bingtuan, a whole prison system out there. And this informant turned out to be, sometimes you deal with people who have had a hard time on the mainland and they escape and they're just terribly excited, terribly unhappy, angry. They don't make good interview subjects. But this man made a wonderful interview subject. He was very balanced, had a lot of information, and did not exaggerate. So I just started taking notes, everything he said. I wrote it down, and then I wrote an article. Well, it was supposed to be an article, but it got longer and longer. It was too long to be an article, not quite long enough for a book. And then I found another colleague who, whereas most of my research had to do with Xinjiang, he was studying prisons in Gansu and Shanghai. In other words, between the two of us, we had Northwest China pretty well covered. So then I wrote a few more general chapters about the prison system in China, which had been poorly understood because there were people, there was the communist propaganda about how wonderful our prison system is, and we just take these people and rehabilitate them and then return them to society. Well, that's kind of nonsense. And at the other extreme, there were people who greatly exaggerated the horrors of the system. Indeed, it was pretty horrible, but it was, for one thing, much, much smaller. The number of prisons in China much, much smaller than the extreme anti-communists were claiming. So I just went in there and did the really hard research work and found some materials. There were some materials of the subject at Chinese University of Hong Kong, University Service Center for China Studies, and interviewed other people, and finally was confident that I understood the nature of the system and the size of the system. So this book called New Ghosts, Old Ghosts, the name was taken from a Dufu poem, Xingui Zhougui, about Xingui Fanyuan Zhougui Ku, and this was about Qinghai. So anyway, I just took the 4 characters for the name of the book, New Ghosts, Old Ghosts. So that's the academic achievement of which I'm most proud.
That it was published in
About 1998, I think.
1998. All right, good.
Nothing decent on the subject had appeared before.
Oh, you are quite modest. I will not allow you to say that. But anyhow, I will go after this book and see if we can find someone to review this book in our journal.
Well, it's a little late. It was
Late,
20 years.
Oh, that's okay.
This predates your journal, I think.
Yes, absolutely. So many predate our journal.
Okay.
I'm not worried about that. Very good, very good. And we are really appreciate for this interview and that you take time to come and really we had such a wide-ranging discussion. I think should be some interest to some of our audience. This or I think.
Well, it's an honor to be invited to do the interview, so thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.